No, I want to talk about Assange, one, because Assange is always salient, but it's especially important to note right now as Biden is pulling the U.S. out of Afghanistan, and we might be closing this book in a way, that the U.S. government at the very same time is working again to try to extradite Assange to the United States.
He's not from here.
Yeah, after their initial attempt was rebuffed by the UK legal system on human rights grounds. And as we know, Assange played no small role at all at exposing American and UK war crimes in Afghanistan and around the world. Could you sort of inform the audience about where this case stands today?
Yeah, so Julian Assange is the first person ever indicted under the Espionage Act for publishing information. Daniel Ellsberg was indicted under the Espionage Act for giving the Pentagon Papers to the New York Times. He was a government insider who had information, and leak is the phrase. I don't like to use leak. I think it has a pejorative connotation. I'd say liberate. He liberated the Pentagon Papers. Edward Snowden, was a government insider who liberated the NSA spying scandal. Chelsea Manning gave Assange those documents. They were all prosecuted, but they weren't the publisher. And traditionally, there's been a real hesitation to go after the media when they actually publish this information. On the other hand, they've been quite ruthless since the Obama administration in going after the leaker, whistleblower, the source. And I think it's really worth stressing that the war on whistleblowers that Obama sort of cemented has always been a backdoor war on journalism, right? With Assange, they have crossed the Rubicon into the thing that Obama was concerned about because of the so-called New York Times problem. How do you set a precedent to indict Assange where you can't indict the New York Times? Remember, the New York Times worked with WikiLeaks early on to publish much of the same information they published. WikiLeaks worked with The Guardian, with Le Monde, with Al Jazeera, with Der Spiegel, all of these sorts of mainstream papers to publish information about U.S. war crimes in Afghanistan, U.S. war crimes in Iraq, the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, and just information like that. There's been 3 separate indictments against Assange. They keep releasing this thing called superseding indictments where they add more charges or more facts. The current charges against him, though, there are 18 charges. 17 of them are brought under the Espionage Act. And you'll read, and it'll be like unauthorized release of defense information or unauthorized retention of defense information. And then it will say in parentheses, in the indictment, in the charge itself, what that defense information is. And it will say Iraq rules of engagement. It will say Guantanamo Bay detainee files, right? Very explicitly, or State Department cables, very explicitly naming these documents that were released and that were in the public interest. So Assange is being charged under the Espionage Act with leaking the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, with leaking the Iraq rules of engagement, not leaking, publishing. He didn't leak them. He's Australian, has no obligation to protect the secrets of the United States government. And then I believe it also throws in the State Department cables, right? I'm looking at the indictment in front of me right now. It says count 3, unauthorized obtaining of national defense information, parentheses, State Department cables. So he is unauthorized obtaining of count 4, unauthorized obtaining of national defense information, Iraq rules of engagement.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's clear as day what they're, why they're so threatened by Assange. And it's frustrating sometimes when you hear people talk about it in the U.S. too, because there's been a kind of like separation of what the U.S.'s case against Assange is from most people's like perception of what's going on in the public. I get a lot of people get worked up about, Assange, discredited himself in the 2016 election. It's like, this has absolutely nothing to do with that. And also that'd be a really absurd thing to go after somebody for publishing information about a candidate that you like who didn't win the election. But yeah,
Assange has been the subject of a ruthless campaign of demonization. Obviously, he has certainly said and done some things that I personally, disagree with, but those are not while he's on trial, right? Yeah. He is on trial for publishing the information Chelsea Manning gave him, the Guantanamo Bay detainee files, the State Department cables, and the Iraq rules of engagement. And I mentioned there were 17 charges brought under the Espionage Act. There's an 18th charge that defenders of the Assange persecution like to trot out. And this is this very bizarre conspiracy to commit a computer intrusion charge. Yeah. It starts off with this very weird claim that Chelsea Manning wanted to access someone else's administrator profile on her computer, so they couldn't track the leaking back to her. And Assange offered to help sort of crack the password. It's not clear he ever did. And that was what it was in the first indictment. That's what it was in the second indictment, first superseding indictment, second indictment. And then the third indictment, this sort of last minute change that keeps all the charges, but changes the narrative. This is after the extradition hearing is well underway, after his defense is raising political questions, right? Assange is wanted for political questions. He shouldn't be extradited. And the U.S. government just comes back with this like kitchen sink narrative that they can bring in with the conspiracy charge, accusing Assange of sort of all of this various hacking. One of the sources for that, who makes his first appearance in this indictment, has admitted to lying to the FBI. He also was labeled a sociopath and a sex offender by the Icelandic court system. There's just weird stuff in there about him talking about how WikiLeaks should help Edward Snowden, and just all this sorts of bizarre stuff. And, you know, it's hard to look at it and not be cynical that this is just like this kitchen sink approach of throwing out a bunch of stuff that sounds derogatory in order to try to make this look like something that it isn't, right? Not a political persecution of a journalist, but certain sort of sycophants of the national security state and haters of Assange have taken great comfort in this third indictment, and they're not justified in doing so. But, you know, haters gonna hate, I believe is what they say.
Yeah, that seems so revealing of their motives. The whole 17-1, and then the one is hacking, like
conspiracy to commit computer intrusion. Yeah. We don't even know if he intruded the computer or not.
I just no. I mean, it's completely absurd. But like, so the U.S. case now, though, the U.K. they ruled that it would be a violation of Assange's human rights if he were to be extradited. So and that has been appealed, correct?
Yeah. So the UK judge rejected all of the press freedom arguments put forward by Assange's defense. But at the last sort of minute, she ruled that it would have been mentally oppressive to Assange to be extradited to the US because of his mental health, because of the likely prison conditions he'd be in, and because of the likelihood he would commit suicide in a U.S. prison. And the U.S., and it's very interesting because under the U.S.-UK extradition treaty, the U.S. is represented in U.K. court by Her Majesty's prosecution at the expense of the British taxpayer. So the U.S. through the Queen's Counsel is appealing this, and they were granted raise, I believe, 5 issues on appeal. They were granted the right to raise 3 of them, including this claim that they should have notified the U.S. so the U.S. could put assurances about his conditions, as well as those actual assurances. What they were initially not allowed to raise on appeal was sort of challenging the judge's medical conclusions, right? The judge made a ruling based on her hearing of various medical facts. She interviewed, or she heard from various psychiatrists from both the defense and the prosecution. And she decided the defense psychiatrist was more trustworthy or had more veracity, and that it weighed more to her. And the U.S. was initially blocked from challenging those medical conclusions. They wanted to argue that one of the defense psychiatrists the evidence from him should have been deemed inadmissible. And thus, if she couldn't have heard that evidence, she couldn't have ruled that Assange, shouldn't have been extradited to the US, and also that she erred when assessing his risk of suicide. It's very rare you get to appeal something like that, especially in the US, but they went before this law lord and this law lady, and they have reinstated the US's appeal rights on this one. And the issue is that the psychiatrist she relied on did 2 reports for the court, testified under cross-examination, turned over all of his notes to the prosecution, but in his earliest report, he did not disclose that Stella Morris was currently Julian Assange's partner or fiance, and they had 2 children together, because she asked him not to due to the credible threats against their life, and that he felt this was a preliminary report and that he was going to get legal advice on how to deal with the issue. The defense is adamant he never would have concealed this from the court. By the time, he could even get legal counsel, Assange and Morris have gone public with this information. He mentions it in his second report. He gives his contemporaneous notes from the first report that includes this information. But the prosecution wants to argue that because he didn't disclose this in this one preliminary report, that the judge didn't even see until after she knew, otherwise, that he somehow wasn't objective, and therefore everything he said should be thrown out. And he interviewed Assange, he interviewed his family, he interviewed childhood friends. He did this very extensive psychiatric profile of him, the most rigorous of any of them. And the prosecution just wants you to throw it all out because in this one preliminary report, he doesn't mention, Julian Assange has 5 children as opposed to 3, basically.
Yeah, it's absurd. And I know we have more to get to, so I'll let us get there. But I just want to note, as you reported, I believe in Jacobin too, that Assange having worries about the safety of his children is like a legit worry, as it's been revealed that like the U.S. Was considering like stealing his child's diapers, if I recall correctly,
to do a DNA test. So there's this private security firm at the Ecuadorian embassy called UC Global. I believe they're a Spanish firm. There's an investigation underway in Spain right now into their conduct. Several of the people who worked with them have come forward and said that the UC Global was in fact working with the CIA to spy on Assange while he was in the embassy. And one of the things they wanted to do was steal one of the diapers to determine via DNA whether or not this child was his or not. They also claim they considered kidnapping and poisoning Assange.
Jesus Christ. Yeah. I mean, again, we'll jump into this other stuff, but I just want to say to the audience, it's like, this is a very clear case, not just the case against Assange that the U.S. has been making, but the way that they've been treating him covertly as well. I mean, this is an attempt to silence and threaten somebody who is publishing information that proved to the world that the United States was engaged in atrocities and crimes against humanity, right? I mean, that's it. It's just, it begins and ends there. And I don't care what other narratives you want to throw out there. What's happening to Assange is another crime against humanity, one that you should take very, very seriously.
And human rights advocates have been able to use some of this information to challenge drone strikes in Pakistan, to give information for Guantanamo detainees to be used in their proceedings. One of the Guantanamo detainees used this to file with the International Criminal Court and was named in their sort of war crimes investigation into Afghanistan. So the result of this information, it wasn't just newsworthy, but human rights advocates representing victims of drone strike, representing people in prison at Guantanamo, have been able to actually make use of it to advocate for their clients.